Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to tackle something a lot of you have been asking about: how to think in English. Not just, basic words and phrases, but really making English the default setting in your brain.
Yeah. Like being able to just switch over and think, dream, everything.
Exactly. And we've actually got some really cool sources for this one, a mix of articles and a YouTube video, all with different perspectives on how to make it happen.
Right. It's almost like unlocking this whole other level of fluency.
Totally. So where should we jump in? I mean, there's so much to cover.
Well, one thing that kept coming up over and over again in all these sources was this idea of immersion, like really surrounding yourself with English.
Right, but it's more than just like passively hearing English, right? I mean, one of the articles talked about how it's about your brain getting used to the patterns of the language.
Yeah, subconsciously. And that's where this story from the YouTube video comes in. They talked about this Korean student who learned perfect English just from watching movies and YouTube.
Wait, really? Just from watching videos?
Seriously. And I think what's so interesting is that he was watching stuff he actually enjoyed, so it wasn't a chore.
So it's like if you're truly engaged, your brain's just absorbing it all without even realizing it.
Right. Like you're not focused on the language itself. You're just enjoying the content.
I've definitely noticed that myself, Like when I get really into a show in English, it's almost like I forget I'm even using another language.
Yeah, totally. Your brain's too busy following the story or, whatever, to even think about translating.
Makes sense. Okay, so we know immersion is important, but these sources also emphasized starting small. Like, don't go from 0 to 100 overnight.
Right, be consistent. One article even suggested something as simple as naming everyday objects around you, but in English.
Oh, like instead of thinking table, you'd think table in English.
Exactly. And another source even took it a step further. They talked about actually labeling things in your house with Post-it notes.
Okay, now that sounds a little intense.
Well, it might sound silly, but think about it. Every time you see that Post-it, you're reinforcing that connection in your brain.
Right, like visual repetition. It's like turning your whole house into a giant English vocabulary lesson.
And this actually ties into another common piece of advice, talking to yourself in English.
Oh yeah, I've heard that before. Like narrate your day, your thoughts, everything, right?
Mm-hmm. Even if it feels a little weird at first.
Trust me, I've tried it. Definitely felt ridiculous. But I did notice that after a while, it got easier to think in those simple sentences without even trying.
And there's actually a really cool psychological basis for this. The YouTube video mentioned a psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, who said that our inner speech, like our thoughts, they come from the language we speak out loud.
Oh, so the more you practice speaking English, even to yourself, the more your brain starts to actually think that way.
Right. And what's even more interesting is that this inner speech actually plays a huge role in our thinking and problem-solving abilities.
So basically, by talking to ourselves in English, we're not just improving our language skills, we're actually like training our brains to be better thinkers.
That's the idea. And you don't need to set aside hours for this either. You can use those little moments throughout the day, like waiting in line or, before you go to bed.
Right, like turning those little wasted moments into little fluency building exercises.
Exactly. Now, we've talked about immersion, we've talked about starting small with things like labeling and self-talk. But how do we actually move beyond single words and start thinking in full sentences and, really complex thoughts?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Well, luckily, these sources had some pretty amazing tips on that. We're going to dive into all of that right after this.
Yeah.
It's amazing how, even without realizing it, so many things we already do can become these little think in English practices.
Right. And one that came up a lot in these sources was keeping a journal, but in English, obviously.
I mean, it's a classic tip for a reason, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's because it really forces you to actually construct those thoughts and sentences, not just passively listening or whatever.
You're actively creating, yeah. And one article actually said it doesn't have to be like this big formal diary or anything, just, jotting down quick thoughts, to-do lists, things like that.
Right, like stuff you'd probably write anyway, just making that effort to do it in English.
Exactly. And speaking of things we already do, the YouTube video had a really cool idea for visual learners.
Oh yeah, I remember that one. Using pictures to learn vocabulary.
Right. Instead of just trying to memorize a word, you find an image that represents it,
Like a visual definition, so it's not just like a word on a page.
They use the example of the word serene. So instead of just repeating it over and over, you find a picture of like a calm lake or something.
Because the visual becomes like this anchor for the meaning.
And that deeper connection makes it way more likely that you'll actually remember it and be able to use it.
Makes total sense. So, journaling, visuals, what other like out-of-the-box techniques did these sources have?
Ooh, okay. There was one that I really liked. One article suggested learning a new skill, but only using English instructions.
Wait, what? So like if I want to learn how to, I don't know, bake bread or something, I have to find like an English recipe.
Exactly. Or, how to knit or code or anything, really. The key is that you're forcing yourself to rely on English resources.
I can see how that would work, yeah. It's like you're not even focused on learning the language itself, but it's happening anyway.
And because you're using it in this practical, goal-oriented way, it just sticks better.
Plus, you pick up all that vocabulary related to the skill you're learning. That's really cool.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of individual stuff. But at some point, you got to actually use the language, right? Like have conversations.
Right. But that's where things can get, like, scary for people. I mean, I've definitely been there.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the sources actually addressed this head on. They said, don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Easier said than done. But I get what they mean, Like, I've definitely frozen up in conversations because I'm too worried about saying the wrong thing.
But the thing is, making mistakes is how we learn. Like, the more comfortable we are with messing up, the more we'll actually be willing to speak.
And honestly, in my experience, most native speakers are super understanding. Like, they appreciate the effort.
Right, and most people are happy to help. Like, they'll correct you in a nice way.
So yeah, get out there, talk to people, and don't sweat the small stuff.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up this section, there's one last tip from the YouTube video I want to mention. It's about paying attention to your internal monologue, like when you're feeling relaxed.
Interesting. What's so special about those moments?
Well, think about it. When you're stressed or under pressure, your brain kind of goes back to your native language.
Totally. Like, it's your default setting.
But when you're relaxed, your mind is more open. And that's when you're more likely to be able to access, like, the English you've been working on.
So it's about noticing when it's happening naturally and then, like, trying to cultivate that state more often.
Exactly. And they even suggested using those quiet moments to, like, actively practice thinking in English. Just, let your thoughts flow.
It's almost like a form of meditation, but for language?
That's a great way to put it. And I think it's a perfect lead-in to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll talk about, like, putting all of this together into a plan that actually works for you.
Right, so we've talked about a ton of different techniques, everything from immersion and self-talk to using visuals and even, like, learning new skills in English. But now the big question is, how do you actually use all this stuff? How do you make a plan that actually works for you?
And that's such a good point. There's no, like, one-size-fits-all solution. It's about figuring out what you're actually going to do, what you can fit into your life.
Right, because motivation only gets you so far. You need a system, so where do you even start with that?
Well, I think the first thing is to, like, think back on everything we've talked about so far. What really stood out to you? What seemed, I don't know, doable, or even, like, fun to try?
Maybe it was labeling everything in your house, or maybe it was trying that thing with learning a new skill using only English instructions.
Whatever it is, write it down. Those are going to be, like, the starting points for your plan.
Okay, so I've got my list of favorites. Now what?
Now it's time to look at your, like, daily routine. Where are the little pockets of time that you could use for, thinking in English?
Okay, so my commute, maybe my lunch break, even just like 5 minutes before bed.
Right. It's about finding those little opportunities. And once you've kind of identified those, get specific. Choose like one or two techniques and set some goals for yourself.
So instead of just saying, I'm going to practice more, you'd say something like, I'm going to spend 15 minutes every night journaling in English. Or I'm going to listen to an English podcast on my way to work.
Exactly. Make it concrete,
Yeah.
and start small. It's much better to do a little bit every day than to try to do everything at once and then burn out.
Speaking of burning out, can we just acknowledge that there are going to be days when it's like really hard?
Oh, for sure. There are going to be days when you're like crushing it and you feel super motivated. And then there are going to be days when you just like want to give up. And that's okay.
The important thing is to not let those bad days completely derail you.
Right.
Like, even if you only do 5 minutes of practice, it's better than nothing.
Totally. Consistency is key. And as you kind of start experimenting with all this and figuring out what works for you, I want to leave you with one final thought.
Okay, lay it on me.
Imagine this. You're watching a movie and you're so into it that you completely forget that it's even in another language. Or you're having this really deep conversation with a native speaker, and the words are just like flowing effortlessly. Or you're reading a book and you're completely lost in the world that the author has created.
Like you've unlocked a whole new level, right?
Exactly. And that's the power of being able to think in English.
Yeah.
It opens up all these possibilities, not just for communication, but for how you experience the world.
So to everyone listening, we say this: embrace the challenge, play around with the techniques we've talked about, and most importantly, believe that you can do it.
Because when you can think in English, you unlock this level of fluency and freedom that you might not have thought possible.
This has been an amazing deep dive, and we hope you're leaving feeling like inspired and ready to start thinking in English today.